Everyone, welcome. I'm Ethan Evans. Many of you know me. I'm here today to chat with Alisa Cohn, who is, wow, I've thought about how to introduce you. You'll have to add to it, but she's got an incredible podcast I appeared on, From Startup to Grown Up. She's written a book by the same title, 25 years coaching startup founders, including several brand name, well known, sort of household name startups. But she does so much more than that, also, is versatile across all kinds of things. We had already talked, and then I saw that she had attended the World Economic Forum in Davos. My chief operating officer, Jason, is here. Earlier this year, we were visioning, like, what do we think we'd like to do in our lives? And one of the things I threw out there as I said, oh, it'd be really neat to attend Davos. And then right across my feed, she was living my dream. So we'll talk some about that. But there's so much more I want to talk about. What did I miss, if anything, Alisa, you would say about your background people should know?
Oh, you're so sweet. That's so nice of you to make that nice introduction, Ethan. And I just so appreciate being here with you today. I think that kind of covers my professional background. I mean, maybe just prior to that, I was in the sort of the business world. I was a management consultant, a strategic management consultant prior to becoming a coach. And maybe two things to say. I wanted to become a coach to make a difference. And so every day I wake up thinking about the difference that I can make for people, for organizations. And then the second thing is, and something we'll talk about today, is I wanted to live an interesting life. When I was, in college, I had a friend, my friend Judith said to me, Alisa, you like to take a big bite out of life. And that's kind of part of my personal and professional mandate as well.
Awesome. Well, I love
Yeah.
that. And I was going to ask, actually, you went to coaching, I would say, relatively earlier than many do, who don't start as coaches, who don't get into coaching from like social work or some background like that. Say, if you don't mind, share a little bit more about what led you to, management consulting, very profitable, very, lots of places you can go from there. How did you end up going to coaching?
Yeah. So prior to management consulting, I was the chief of staff to the provost at a university in New England. And, at some point I was helping them, I was running strategic planning. And the provost said, you can't manage faculty because they have tenure. And I was very young. To your point, I was actually very young. I was a very young chief of staff. And, why he hired me is a whole other story. But like, I thought to myself, it can't be that people only do what you want them to do. Otherwise, you'll fire them. It just can't be. So I went off to business school kind of thinking about that. I got all turned around. I focused in finance and accounting and strategy. And I exited into PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I was sort of on the fast track program. So it was 5 years to partner. And I did my audit hours. I did my tax hours. I also did management consulting. I did strategy. I did marketing consulting, whatever. 2.5 years in, I just woke up one day and thought, this is not for me, because it was such a big firm, because it was sort of the same, wrote over and over again kind of things we were doing in this formulaic way, because I had this music in my head, which was to make a difference, that the work of my hands mattered. And so I thought, I hope I get the flu so I don't have to go into work tomorrow. And the next day, actually that day, I got the flu and I was rushed to the emergency room and I was down for the count for like 2 weeks. And I just thought, okay, my body is speaking to me. I understand I have to do something else. And I looked around and looked around and looked around trying to figure out what I was going to do. And it was very, washed up at like 26 or something. But then I went to a conference. I was volunteering at a conference and I met a coach and I was like, ah, what is that? I want to do that. It was like violins played for me. And, there's like a process to get there. And in the meantime, I became an executive and the CFO of a startup and the head of strategy of another startup. But like I took coach training and put one foot in front of the other to get to be a coach with some leadership experience pretty early in my career.
That's amazing. Because you just mentioned casually, your expertise has become working with startup leaders, but you only spent a relatively short time in that environment yourself.
Yeah, 2 years.
Yeah. All right. Well, that And by the way,
That's
I
dog
think
years, by the
coaching is
way.
about the insights and the questions you ask. So it's not so much about having been in the chair, although that also obviously helps a lot. But let's talk more. One of the things I think a lot of people are interested in, I know I was always interested in, and in a way still am. You've got a nice job. Like I was coaching someone earlier today. He works at a not quite one of the top tech companies, but at a recognizable name you would know, a company that's household. You've used their products, I'm sure. He's making very good money. He's unhappy with his boss. His question is all, how do I go get another high paid corporate job? But a lot of people either don't consider starting a startup or going to a startup, or they're afraid to. And I guess one thing I wrestle with a lot is how to coach people who are being held back by their fears. But
Mm-hmm.
sometimes those fears are for good reasons. You must have a lot of wisdom about when to make a startup journey or not, and how to think about that. How do you have a framework for that?
Yeah, probably have a few frameworks. First of all, it's the notion of facing your fears, which really is at the heart of the matter for everybody in terms of getting in the way of doing the thing they want to do or even exploring the thing they want to explore. Long ago, before I did, sort of what I do now really fully is leadership coaching, but before that, I did also sort of career transition and all kinds of
Mm-hmm.
coaching. And my experience is that people would have a lot of reasons why they wouldn't even network to find the new job or send in that resume or take the first step. And it's
Mm-hmm.
really because of their fears. And I think it's very helpful as a starting point to identify what the fears are. And so it might be, I won't get the job, and then I know I won't get the job, or it won't work out for me. Or sometimes it is, it might work out for me, and then I'm going to have to face, sort of dealing like living into this thing that I was always dreaming about. So I think step one is always really trying to articulate, identify what the fears are, and then the second thing is understanding what you're getting yourself into. So to your point, tech company, well, any company, any large company has a certain, I always think about is you have a basket. Your career has a basket. A large company tends to have a basket that we understand. It's like the kinds of meetings you have, the kinds of sort of hierarchy you have, the kinds of work you do. It has a certain kind of basket. And there's good things in the basket and there's bad things in the basket. Now, if you think about a startup is going to give you more chaos. You might like that or not like that. More autonomy. You probably have to have a lot more independence. Probably fewer meetings, maybe to a fault. And then also the ability to have an impact in probably a way that a large company is not going to allow you to have. Now, that might be a good thing. That might be a bad thing. So you've got to kind of weigh that basket against the large company basket. And one other thing I would say is that in large companies, you often have a lot of support around you. So middle executives and senior executives have a lot of support, and they dream of going to a startup. And then what happens is, and this has happened to many of my colleagues and friends, and certainly some of my clients who've gone into a startup and realized, oh my gosh, I have to do everything myself. I don't have the same kind of support that I had at that large company. And this is not what I signed up for. This is not what I dreamed of or not what I wanted. So really coming to terms with what it's like inside of a startup, the kind of support you'll get, the environment that will make you successful, identifying your actual values, sort of in terms of what you want in your job, and then understanding what your basket is now and what the basket is you really would like to have in the future. Those are some of the ways to approach whether or not you should join a startup.
There's so much going on in that answer. And it's so systematic. I think it's very good and correct. Your coaching is showing to walk people through that. I think a lot of people start with, well, I think I want that other basket, but I'm afraid that the startup will go under and then I'll have to take a pay cut to go there and then I'll end up unemployed.
Yeah.
That's now, there's a lot of proof right now that staying where you are, you might end up unemployed also. But how much do you run into, or have you had experience with people whose fear is primarily sort of the financial side?
Well, the financial side is important. And, Ethan, I feel like you've written about this yourself. Like, actually, the more you can do in general to live below your means, save your money, the more you have options that you could buy yourself options. You've earned
Yep.
options, right? And so for any of my clients or anyone I've ever sort of just counseled, like, a friend or a colleague, it's always a pragmatic concern. How long can you go without working? Period. Like, that's actually a very helpful question. Like, what are your people don't know what their expenses are. They don't know how long they can go without working. One time I did this with somebody, and I said, how long can you go without working? She said, well, we're going to have to, she and her husband, we're going to have to work a very, 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 very hard for a very, very long time. Weirdly, a year later was COVID, and she and her husband retired. It turned out not to be the case. So they had to work.
Yeah.
Right. So when you apply the actual rational prism filter of what you spend and what you have, that reveals basically how much risk you can take financially. So that's one thing to take off the table. I think that there is another layer of ego risk. I will take this risk, I will do this new thing, and then it won't work out. And everybody's going to laugh at me, or they're going to think something, or I'm going to think something of myself, or, whatever that is. Or I will take this risk and they won't laugh, but yeah, the startup will go under. And then what will I do? I just talked to somebody this week, one of my clients, who was just kind of musing, gosh, sometimes I feel like if I lost this job, I wouldn't have anything to do next. He's in his 40s. And guess what? Unless he has a rich uncle, which he doesn't, he's going to have to figure out what he's going to do next. Like, people can figure things out when bad things happen. And so I think really assessing your financial risk, coming to terms with what you think it means about you and identity, and unpacking that, which is a big kind of coaching, I think, mission for everybody. And then understanding kind of what your plan is when and if something bad will happen, because bad things do happen, that will make you feel safer to be able to take the risk that you might want to take.
Yeah, I absorbed a lot from Tim Ferriss' 4-Hour Work Week, where he said, look, make your worst case plan and then how you would get out of it.
Yeah.
Because first, when you start writing down what you're actually fearing, it does end up sounding awfully apocalyptic and unrealistic. Like, well, my startup's going to go under. Okay, that could happen. But then there'll be absolutely no other jobs. And so then I'll lose my house and I'll lose my family and I'll have to live under a bridge. And then, okay, but what would you do? Instead, you'd cut your expenses and retool yourself for another career. But I see this a lot. And look, I was subject to it myself too. So I can say I've had these fears, including the irrational ones. And I think all of them, to some degree, you talked about the baskets, they do come down to a fear of the unknown. The job I have is something I know, and everything else is something I don't. And until this becomes often so uncomfortable or negative, I'm like, yeah, I know it, and I know I want out of it. That's when people move. But the startup,
I think that's I just want to say, I just think that's very astute. That the fear of the unknown is a very important point. Yeah.
Yeah. So you obviously have focused on helping people leading startups mature with them. I grew incredibly fast in my early startup experiences. They were definitely helped me get on the track I was on. What, I guess, would you say for the people who haven't tried a startup yet, if they can get over the fear, what would you say, what can make that basket better? So people know the larger company basket or the sort of standard, Dilbert office cubicle basket. I have my own opinions, but what makes the startup basket fantastic?
Well, I mean, so many fantastic things about working in a startup. I mean, first of all, you really can have an impact. And in my book, From Startup to Grown Up, I constantly say, if you don't like it, get a job at IBM. No offense to IBM, but it's a certain kind of vibe, right? So the thing is, when you're at IBM, fill in your large tech company here, you're affecting this little piece of this little cog in this little system. Good luck. When you're at a startup, you're actually making things happen. And if you weren't there, that thing wouldn't happen. And it's such a rewarding experience to really like touch the thing with your hands and to see progress so rapidly. The second thing is it is such a rewarding experience to work with all these people who are so passionate about something, who all bring their like interesting, experiences to it. And then also you can advance in leadership and get so much experience in so many different things so quickly inside of a startup. So like just off the top of my head, those are some of the great things about your career. Obviously, and people who I work with in startups, they are mission focused. They want to get, they're not career and benefits focused. Eventually a company grows and you have to be career benefits focused and structure focused. And there's nothing wrong with that. But they are so into the mission of what they're trying to build and they see it coming to light and you can be part of that. And that is something that large companies don't tend to offer.
Yeah, it's very hard. You're right. I once talked to someone, this is now years ago, but he was a developer at Microsoft and he owned like the third item in the second menu, and he like paste. He didn't own cut and he didn't own copy. He owned paste. and like, yes, I do paste. Like, and he'd been working on paste for 2 years. And I was just thought like, oh my God, what a definition of hell. And yet that can be it can make sense for Microsoft to have a whole team working on paste, but it can be hard if you're on the paste team, and let alone if you're on that team on a less successful, less well-known product.
100%. Yeah. And it also just depends on your personality, which I think is so important to assess, like your values and your personality, what you want out of life, what you want out of your career. Self-knowledge helps you understand how you like your basket, your current career basket, and how you're going to like your future career basket. Because what you just described is, first of all, it's so funny. Also, what if you weren't even on paste? What if you were on something that was like, two rungs below paste or something, right?
Absolutely.
Like the back end of paste, right?
Right.
So you might not like that, but what you really might like, and this is what I tell my clients all the time, you might love the commute, which is only like a 20-minute walk. You might love your colleagues you work with. You might love the security. You might love the routine. You might love that you can play music every night, whatever. And that's fantastic.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
if you want to build something,
it's a lovely point. And I'm not by any means pushing everybody to be in a startup. And in fact, of course, I spent most of my later career in a very large company, although at the time I was at Amazon, it mimicked a startup, at least in growth rate.
It seems like
so it had that constant change ability to make an impact. But it became a big behemoth, of course. To your point, I guess, I was there when we first launched Italy and then Spain as marketplaces for Amazon. And like launching Italy took like 90 teams. And by the time we did Spain, it was 110 teams coordinating. And I was just thinking like, this is not agile, right? Because they're celebrating like, we coordinated 110 teams to do this. Yay! And you're like, like, yes, good. We're now, in Spain, good, but yikes.
Yeah.
And that comes with large company. So, for the people here, the people who are going to come to listen to you and me, they're ambitious. They're taking time from their day to listen either about startups or about large events or about leadership. For that set of people, that shapes their basket somewhat. But if they are being held back, it's either fear or the skills to navigate those transitions. Having coached way more people than me, how would you advise the listeners here and to the video in the future to get into that learning process or that change process so that they can adapt? Like, is there a broader rule besides be a learner that's specific? How do you grow your career? How do you go from startup to grown up systematically, besides read your excellent book?
Thank you for the plug on my book. I I think you've said it very well. I think be a learner. So then how do you really operationalize be a learner? So number
Okay.
one, I would say find mentors, not a mentor, mentors who can help you think about your career, about your specific industry, or function, who can help you become a better leader, who can help you were talking today about networking, help you think about networking events. Multiple mentors help you learn faster. I would also say put yourself into situations where you are learning on the job. You are forced to learn how to do something. You're forced to learn how to create a budget. You're forced to learn how to lead when you only have influence and not a sort of formal authority, where you're forced to maybe even do something that's more technical than you would experience. So putting yourself into on-the-job situations, either in your volunteer work or, like sort of extracurricular or in your job, also help you with rapid skills acquisition, reading, and I think being a heads-up player. So like, this is what I think people fail to do, and I think, Ethan, you talk about this a lot in your own writing, which I think is so helpful. Look around and see who's getting ahead around here. What skills do they have? What traits do they have? Why are they getting ahead? And especially if you think that's a nincompoop. Well, okay, someone thinks he's not a nincompoop because he's getting ahead. So kind of getting over yourself and your own judgment to see, what is being rewarded around here. And then, refining your own approach based on that. And so I think like some of my clients will regularly tell me that things are like, beneath them, or they don't want to do that's not their personality, whatever. If something is not illegal, immoral, or unethical, I think it is fair game for you to really study in your workplace to see what's going on, to see if taking some steps to develop those traits will help you also succeed.
I love that. And you're right. I do talk about that. The way I frame it, which I think will resonate with you, is people come to me as a coach all the time and they complain and they say, my boss is a micromanager, or my boss doesn't, entrust me with big projects, or fill in the blank. And I say, well, who are they trusting? Because there is going to be someone. And then there's a couple of things you can do. You can observe them and copy them. Often you can go to that person and say, hey, I notice you work really well with Ethan. What's your secret? Some people will be like, I'm not telling you, that's my competitive secret. But a lot of people will be like, oh, it's easy. I just, whatever. And you can learn that way. But slamming your own head into the wall just probably means you're trying the same thing, as opposed to figuring out what someone else has found the unlock, right? Someone else has found the cheat code to that manager. Just ask them.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, my last question before we switch to large events. I joined several startups as like the fifth or sixth employee. So I would see them and they would have an idea and be going and maybe have a little bit of funding. And I'd be like, okay, I'm in. I wanted to found something, but I never made that jump until now. I work for myself, which I'm a startup of me. That's a little bit different though. What would you say is the difference between joining a startup and being the founder? How do you?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of changes, but everyone here wants to hear a couple things to help them sort out. Should I be looking for the founder to join, or should I be doing it myself?
Yeah. I mean, I think we could do it like hours on that. I mean, are entrepreneurs born or made? My experience is entrepreneurs are born. And yes, they can be made.
Okay.
But that they're born, that you see entrepreneurial experiences. I had Gary Vaynerchuk on my podcast, and he told me that he was known as being entrepreneurial out of the womb, that when he was 6 years old, he didn't start a lemonade stand. He started a lemonade franchise. And he hired the neighborhood kids and his sister, and they did the lemonade stand. He would ride on his big wheel, remember big wheels, to go check on the different franchisees,
oh my
right?
God.
That's entrepreneurship. And you tend to see early signs of entrepreneurship in the people who go off and found companies. The second thing is people who found companies tend to have this itch. I mean, it's sort of adjacent, right? Like they tend to have an itch. They can't work for other people. They really,
Yeah.
they sort of can't help but found a company. And there's a way in which, like, honestly, if they could help it, they would. And you see that also because very successful founders that I coach are on their second startup, their third startup, their fourth startup. They can't stop. It's like, a thing that they need to do and want to do. And so I would, sort of say builders, and they have a risk tolerance that allows them to do that. And I do mean risk tolerance. I don't mean it means like, oh, but they're all set. They were not all set in their first startup. They were in credit card debt. They did everything they could to kind of make it work, and they were successful or they won't. And so I think that's to my mind, what stands out from people who found companies versus joining a startup who can have all those, advantages and sometimes even be founder-like, but they are not the ones who took the risk, and they are not the ones out there raising money, and they're not the ones dealing with the problems that are inevitable when it comes to startups.
Yeah. And I honestly, I think we talked about self-knowledge earlier. I'm the operations guy. I understand that my role is often your founder is this crazy person who's got 3 ideas a second and can't focus and definitely doesn't want to worry about making sure that there's desks in the office, and 50 million other sort of practical issues. And I found I loved being like near that person, but my value was make their crazy shit sane. Like make
Right.
it, bring it down a little bit. And that can be my point there in sharing that is having been around so many founders and startups are so venerated. Of course, I have the pull, like, shouldn't I build my own thing? Shouldn't I do my own thing? I'm in a safe position where I could take risks. I actually don't think so. Like my expertise, I'm this other thing, right? Like some people are the quarterback, some people are the receiver. The quarterback's the center of the team in this analogy, but they can't do anything without someone to catch the ball.
Yeah.
And I caught balls,
Yeah.
and they threw them, a lot of them in random directions. So
That's very wise. I think that's it. So it's like know yourself and play your position.
yeah. And my position is much more a COO type of organize the company infrastructure, the technical infrastructure. And that was a great career. And, you and I both referenced my previous guest, Molly Graham. That's her world, right? With Glue Club, it's all COOs and people who focus on catching the balls that the brilliant, necessary, hair on fire founder is throwing up randomly, praying that someone will take their idea somewhere.
That's true.
Um,
Yeah.
all right, so let's go ahead and pivot a little. Of course, I came to you and asked you about Davos, but you go to lots of high-profile events, and I'm sure. Well, I don't know. Let's begin at the beginning. How did you start going to events or learning about events? Because coaches don't necessarily do that.
Right. I definitely want to get into kind of our own inner limitations about why we don't do this. And so I'm going to start by talking about mine. Long
Okay.
ago, when I was the chief of staff to the provost, I had to co-host with him these faculty mixers, like drinks or
Okay.
whatever. So it was 10 months on the academic year, and so we did one a month. So I did 10 a year, and I was there for about 2 years. And I was young. I was a shy kid. I was a shy kid, and I was a shy, let's say, young adult. And so it was painful for me to go to these events, like painful. I was like painfully shy, but I had to be one of the co-hosts. So I did a deal with myself, and I started this on day one. I'm just going to go. I'm going to shake hands with people. I'm going to meet 2 people and have a conversation, and then I'm going to leave. And I did that. And one time, and by the way, faculty themselves, kind of awkward, just to say, many scientists, many other faculty, very awkward people. And so there was a time that I did the thing. I shook the hand of this person. I met him. We had this extremely awkward conversation. And then I was like awkwardly, okay, I'm going to go now or whatever. And then I went this way and he went that way. And we met again at the coat check, right? Oh, I couldn't get rid of this guy. It was so embarrassing. It was just like embarrassing. So I say that because after doing 20 of these events, I became pretty good at mixing with people. And that is an important point for everybody. Like I started off quite shy and quite awkward, and I learned how to do it by letting myself be embarrassed and trying and give myself little assignments. And then I became actually kind of good at going to events. Should I keep going? I have more to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
Okay. So the second thing that happened is early on in my days of becoming a coach, I thought to myself, I woke up one day and thought, I know I'm going to coach Bill Clinton. That's what I'm going to do. And I was like very clear that I'm going to coach Bill Clinton. So I thought, okay, step one, meet Bill Clinton, right? So I thought, how am I going to meet Bill Clinton? I know he hangs out at this event, which used to get a lot of publicity, called Renaissance Weekend. I've heard about Renaissance Weekend. I've heard about Bill Clinton kind of, in the heyday of his presidency, like, hanging out there. And I thought, okay, who do I know who knows everybody? I called my friend Evie and I said, Evie, Renaissance Weekend. And she said, oh, what a great idea. And this was the big one they do is in December. And 6 weeks later, I was there in Charleston Place, which is where they hold it. And I was there at this event, like hobnobbing with all these, frankly, quite fancy people, again, at a pretty young age. And just realizing that suddenly there was a whole universe open to me by virtue of being at this event. Let me just explain Renaissance Weekend. It is not Renaissance Fair. It is not turkey legs. It is not jousting. It's sort of the original Ideas Fest. It was founded about 45 years ago by the former ambassador to the UK under the Clinton administration. And he and his wife wanted to have deeper than cocktail party conversations and multi-generational relationships. So they sort of brought together 60 families in the very beginning, and then they, sort of took it from there. It was sort of known as the original Ideas Fest. You have to be nominated to attend, and everyone there is put on panels. And when you're not on your panel, you go to other people's panels, and it's a big kind of, if I may say so, nerd talk fest. It's amazing. So extremely prominent people, and I had the best time and met all these prominent people. P.S. Bill Clinton wasn't there. And I didn't meet him until years later. And I think a lot about sort of the corridor principle, like you get this goal in mind and you walk down the path towards the goal, and then you see all these interesting doors on the other side. And it turned out Renaissance Weekend was an incredibly interesting door. And I realized that being in the room with prominent people and being in the room with people who were sort of like-minded, interesting, and engaged in life was going to be very beneficial for me personally as well as my career. So that's how it all started.
Well, we will dig deeper into that. I love that might be the slickest, and I know you probably didn't. That might be the slickest name drop. Oh, I didn't meet him till later. That was like, oh, what a way to bring the story home. I didn't meet him there. I met him later. Great segue. So I'm a big fan of this idea that you are the 5 people you spend the most time with. Now, obviously, at Renaissance Weekend, you're not spending the most time with those people in your life. But is there an analogy there when you say to being in the room with smart people? Is it like a temporary up-leveling of the people you're spending time with? Is that how you see the impact? Or is there another? What's the benefit you get from these smart people that you won't necessarily see again or for a long time?
Yeah, there's several answers to that. I love how you just said a temporary uplift. Actually, you're there with them for 4 days. Everyone's like mixing together, super casual, off the record conversations, leave your resume at the door. It's like it's very deep. Like you have real talk conversations with people. And yes, you see other ways of living. You see aspirations, you see people really wanting to make a difference in the world, you see people who've been enormously successful, and you realize they're just like you. And so you see what's possible for you in this sort of very 4-day, let's say, concentrated way. That's one thing. And I just want to say, and you build genuine relationships with folks. That's what's amazing about it, is that it's not like transactional. It's very much a family, and this community becomes a part of a family. And so you then become connected in a family way with these amazing people. And some of them are famous and some of them aren't, right? It's sort of just like this wonderful engaged group of people. But also you actually do become friends with them and you spend a lot of time with them. I live in New York, and so there's a ton of them here in New York, and we get together on a regular basis. There's also something amazing because these are held at certain times a year. They're held 5 times a year. The biggest one is held in New Year's. And for me, I used to go regular. I always go regular on New Year's, and I used to only go on New Year's. And so it's like a same time next year kind of
Yep.
situation. And
Yep.
I'd see people and it'd be like, oh my God, a whole year has gone by. Let's catch up on the year. And there's something really quite beautiful about that kind of a friendship. And then ultimately that does turn into, because they're in different parts of the country. When you go to that part of the country, you get to see them. You see them in New York. And actually, I do spend a lot of time with them, both as friends in real life, but also the sort of spiritual element of them being in your life is definitely part of the sort of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Well, and I think in many ways, so far, everything I feel like we've talked about is like it's both basic networking and super up level networking, because you began with how to get comfortable in a room, how to talk to strangers. And I will say, um, I was you, I was the same. I didn't like to talk to strangers, classic engineer, very introverted. My idea of hell was a cocktail party. And of course, now I've learned, um, I think my lesson there was, oh gosh, his name, I'm blanking on it. It was the guy who always did late night interviews in like a bow tie. Anyway, um, he's retired now. But um, he said, someone asked him, how can you just sit down with anyone and have a good interview? And he said, well, I've just, everyone has something interesting. You just have to be curious about them. You just have to ask
Yes.
questions. I don't want to I always, I'm sensitive to the word just. It's a way to make things seem small when they're not. You just have to. Just this, it's simply that. But being legitimately curious about someone else has 2 advantages. First, it really will change your sense of introversion. You can ask them about whatever. And second, it makes them do most of the talking. And most people are very happy. Most people, not everyone, but most people, if you ask them a legitimate question that really shows true interest, and then you watch them and nod, they want to tell you because people want to be listened to. And so I'm going on about this for a minute because it is the gateway. But then you get to these events. So say a little more now. If you take it, you're the expert compared to me in this. What role should events play in someone's life? Like if I'm working in a large company or in a startup or, sort of not in our role as coaches, how should I think about attending conferences or trying to get to networking events? What
Yeah.
do you say to your startup people?
Yeah. By the way, the point about curiosity is so key. Like for everything, in terms of mixing with new people, curiosity, step one, like so
Hmm.
helpful. But the answer is that I think what many people do is they kind of keep their heads down and do their work. And then they let life, sort of take them. And I'm
Mm.
very sympathetic. They have families and they have like things going on. It is very hard to carve out time and go to an event, right? You got to research what it is. You got to kind of want to go. You're kind of uncomfortable. You don't know what it's going to be like, back to the unknown. So it's much more comfortable to do what you've always done. But I think that everyone should be taking, I mean, I'm not going to set up a time, but like if you don't go to any events, you should go to one a year. If you go to one a year, you should go to 2 or 3 a year. And they have to be the right kinds of events where you're going to meet people who are going to make sense for you. And the reason that's important is number one, back to my aspiration, which is to live an interesting life. It's helpful
Mm.
to put yourself into events, especially when there are different parts of the world that you are, different parts of the country, because you're going to meet people that you would not organically meet, and that's going to bring you a more interesting life. The second reason is because the success in your career is by having a broad and deep network. It's broad and it's deep. So deep is that you know people over and over again. You've known them, they're old friends, you know them really well. They're neighbors, they're people you see, as I said, once a year at Renaissance Weekend, whatever that is. That is deep. Broad is how you build what's called loose ties. And you know about this, which is that actually most of your opportunities come from loose ties. You meet somebody, this happens to me all the time. I've known people, I've known people, I have an extensive network and of course, community and group of friends. And then I meet new people. And the first thing out of their mouth is, oh, you're a coach. I know someone who needs a coach. They just met me, right? They just met me, but they're happy to refer me and send me this person. And it's just a very interesting thing that like, actually your loose ties will often be the ones who give you interesting connections. And that happens over and over again. And then the third thing I would say is that you're doing your thing. So I'm a coach. Maybe you say I'm in the startup world. I live in New York. I kind of have these narrow window of what I do. It's really important to broaden my window, to meet artists, to meet people who live in New Mexico, to sort of emote, to meet poets, to meet this Renaissance Week we meet everyone, like history professors, musicians, because yes, it makes you more interesting. It gives you more interesting life, and it makes you more interesting. But also, you're like, oh wow, that thing that you do in poetry or the way you think about history gives me an incredible insight about the way I do my work. It helps me better at my craft when I'm exposed to different people with their adjacent or not so adjacent ideas, and I can make those connections.
Yeah, you said so much I want to comment on. The first thing is, when you talk about people being heads down, I call this work hard and hope to be noticed.
That's right.
This is what most people are doing in their careers. And the meritocracy idea deludes them into thinking this is correct. If only I'm a hard enough worker, if only my work is good enough, I will be selected. I don't need to talk about my work. I don't need to get to know people. I don't need to develop relationships. I just need to be better and better at doing more and more work, and success will follow. This just isn't true. It's a hope-based strategy that leads to disappointment. So whether it's networking events or somewhere else, you have to break out of work hard and hope to be noticed. On your interesting life, I want to share a story of where this came super true to me about 3 years ago. In fact, 3 years ago to the day, in a sense. The war in Ukraine had started, and one of my friends, I reached out to him, networking, talking to him about doing something. And he said, I can't talk right now. I'm going to go to Poland and see if I can help the refugees. And I was like, what? So long story short, this spoke to me very strongly. And I said, well, I think I want to come with you. And he's like, but I don't have a plan yet. I'm just going to go figure it out. Like, why don't you wait till I have a plan? I'm like, no, we'll figure it out together. So I flew to Poland, having never been to Poland, having never really wanted to go to Poland. But now I had a mission that I believed in. We networked around the city of Krakow, asking who was helping with refugees and whatever, met these wonderful people. Not taking up the podcast with just this story, though, I ended up making all these connections where now we have a refugee center in Krakow that's in its third year. I've met all these wonderful people from Poland and more wonderful people from Ukraine. It's changed my life in a way that I never anticipated. And in the end, what did I risk for this? Every single person here could risk this much, I'm going to bet. You might have to push more than I did. I bought a plane ticket to Poland, and you're allowed to fly with $10,000 in cash. So I took $9,000 out of my bank account, figuring I'll find a way to use it to help people. And so with the plane ticket, it cost me about $10,000. Now, for a lot of people here, $10,000 is a lot of money, but I bet there's very few listeners that if I told you I have a way to change your life for 10 grand, you couldn't do it. So don't use my way, do it your way. But that interesting life, I want to take a sidelight. Do you have an interesting, where one of these conferences opened your door to something completely unexpected that way? Like, what is Alisa's interesting left turn that you want to share?
Oh my God. I mean, so many. I mean,
That's
just
why I'm
to
letting
say,
you pick one.
yeah, so many. I mean, we talked about Davos. So I met at Renaissance Weekend, I met somebody who ultimately hired me. So I coached her. And I worked within the organization, and they invited me to Davos for my first time to do a book talk there when my book came out. Right. So like just that. And, that's very interesting, obviously. And
Yeah.
and I would say that like, just to, sort of talk about like life goals, 10 years prior to this, maybe 15 years prior to this, someone had said to me, well, you should be at Davos. And I was like, me? Oh my God, me, little old me. And there I was giving a book talk at Davos, And so after having been on the Tim Ferriss show, talking about my book, right? So like, that was a big year of life goals for me, I would say, like life goals unlocked. And that, it was a number of things that all came together, but certainly Renaissance Weekend, brought that to me. I mean, I would add that like all the trips I've taken, many trips I've taken with these folks, and having just like a great time. It's not even professional. It's just having a great time, in like Lisbon, in New Mexico, in California. And that's very rewarding in and of itself, right? Sort of meeting people and having them, having the experiences of having this sort of beautiful network in your life, beautiful community, I should say, in my life.
Yeah. And it's something I'd be interested in your take on it. I have found the thing I learned about networking is, of course, I always thought of networking as like walking around a cocktail party, introducing yourself to strangers.
Right.
Whereas in fact, networking is talking to interesting people, listening to them. And then when you need something, the magic of networking is the thing that I need may be incredibly easy for someone else.
Yeah.
So to illustrate, I mentioned we started this refugee work in Poland. We had someone who had 10 suitcases full of emergency medical supplies. They wanted to get to Poland. But of course, it costs a lot of money to check those. And so I reached out to my network and said, hey, is there anybody who knows someone who could get 10 suitcases of medical supplies comped on a United flight? Well, my friend said, completely out of the blue, I had no idea, oh, yeah, I know the chairman of the board for United. So the next thing I know, I'm on an email with the chairman of the board. I'm apologizing and like, look, I'm an executive, so I know this is like 7 levels below your attention span. Please just hand me off to someone and But for him, it was for the chairman of the board, it was a chance to personally connect to doing something good. For my friend, it cost him no more than an email to say, hey, you might want to help out with this. No one was put out. Not really.
Yeah.
And that's the magic, I think, of a network, is what's hard for me may be really easy for you. Like your friend who invited you to give the book talk probably wasn't mortgaging their reputation to invite you.
Right. No, in fact, the opposite, right? Like it helped them sort of showcase something that was valuable for the folks in their world, right? And also, obviously, it was good for me. And then I would just say that, like, I do feel that the content I create, as I know that you do, is actually very useful for people. And so it gives me an opportunity to give my message on a larger stage, which I really think is productive for everybody. So what a lot of what you're talking about is also when you network or build relationships, which is the way I think about it. Step one is like actually not wanting anything. Step one is actually just being curious about the person, getting to know them, asking deeper than cocktail party conversations, practicing the kinds of questions that elicit better answers. Side note, if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to send you all a list of my favorite questions, which I have on a little PDF somewhere, because it really helps spark better and more genuine relationships. And then the second thing is that, to your point, actually, you want to see yourself as a giver. So I always say to people, how can I add value to your life? What can I do to be helpful? I really always think about, oh, this article will be good for that person, or like, oh, I should connect those two people, or whatever that is. And then third, very often when you're making an ask, it's often an opportunity for everybody in that sort of like chain. And when you're kind of like, oh, I don't want to ask, right? Because you could have been like, oh, I'm uncomfortable, I don't want to ask. And then you would have missed out on the opportunity to actually help. And you would have missed out on the opportunity to give that person, the chairman of United, an opportunity to help in actually an important mission. And so you have to think of yourself as like every time you don't put yourself out there with your ideas, with your value, even with your asks, you're being stingy. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, because again, the magic is it's often easy for other people and they get to feel good about themselves, and not just
Exactly.
feel good in an ego sense, they get to do something good and
Right.
practically helpful. And this unspoken like favor economy or connection economy, there's another fun study that shows that people will do things for free that you couldn't pay them to do,
That's right.
right? That
That's right.
I think the study was first done on like these rich men who, for a fundraiser, drove buggies around a park, and you couldn't possibly hire these CEOs or whatever to drive a buggy, but for a fundraiser, they would all take their day and get dirty and show, because it's just different. Um, so I want to be mindful of your time. We're almost at the end of the hour. Anything else you would love to share, either about yourself or about the events things that we haven't covered?
Well, I think, first of all, I think that people might be thinking, okay, but what event should I go to? So there's a
Mm.
number of private events out there. Like I get to go to sort of these different masterminds and whatnot. When you say to your friends and to people around you, I'm trying to attend more events this year, what are the most interesting events that you've been a part of? First of all, they'll tell you, so then you know what they are. Second of all, they might say, oh yeah, you want to come? Or whatever. I've been to a number of masterminds because people have like, oh yeah, you want to come? And they just invite me. That's amazing. And so that's kind of how to do it. Second of all, again, if you don't like, there's a lot of events out there. There's TED, as I mentioned, Renaissance Weekend, there's Davos. If you don't know what other high profile events are going to work for you, I would Google high profile events and find out what it says. And again, ask other people, what are the high profile events? You really have to get out of your own way when you go, because you might be, if you aren't going already, you might be uncomfortable. So spending a lot of time reminding yourself of who you are at your best, really getting that mindset of the moments where you shine, and locking that in as you approach those events, and then having a strategy, having a set of back pocket questions, recognizing that you're going to feel awkward, and that's okay. You're probably not every conversation is going to be great, but that your whole job is to walk up to, I'm making this up, 10 people and introduce yourself and talk to them and find out a great story about them that they're not telling everybody else. And then the last thing is that the way to walk away from somebody, because that's the other thing. Oh, once I get into a conversation, how do I walk away? You just say, it's been so great talking to you. I'm going to mingle a little bit. They're all there to mingle, just like you. It's not a problem. So I hope that gives people, and I'm happy to dive into more of that, but I just hope it gives people a tactical experience of like, okay, I'm in. What are my steps? What should I do?
I love it. And Jason has already emailed you, prompting you to remember to send the question list. So we'll get that out to people.
Sure.
But I agree. I love that. It's been so great talking to you. I'm gonna mingle. I'm gonna
That's
mingle a
right.
little bit. It's a great. Well, it's the polite exit.
It's a polite exit.
It's the polite
Right.
exit that's very understandable, and it's contextual, right? We're all here for that. Because that other person, if they're clinging to you, is the scared person who's like, oh, I found one decent person who's talking to me. I'm gonna stay with them all night. And I get
Yes.
that. And
Yes. And you might also feel like oh yeah, me too, right? But no. Actually, you're there to mingle. So you have to have a mission for yourself, which might be to meet 10 people and have an interesting conversation. It might also be to learn how to gracefully or not so gracefully leave that person. I think people are also just overly concerned with being embarrassed. I've been embarrassed many times in my life. It hasn't killed me yet.
wow, that's since you were on the Tim Ferriss podcast, I actually did his exercise because of embarrassment of go to the mall and just lay down in the middle of the sidewalk and like let people look at you like you're crazy, and you'll very quickly realize like, okay, it's awkward, but it's not killing me.
Oh, I love that.
It's in his book. If you ever, it's a great,
Yeah,
there are other
I'll
ways to
tell
do
Tim
it.
you did that. He will appreciate that people take his advice. That's
Oh, I
amazing. It is such a
absolutely,
powerful thing to do.
yeah. I've done a lot of the things that come from his book, and it's really helped me.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I'll thank you so much for taking the time. And I guess this has been great. It's been so great talking to you. I'm going to mingle.
I was going to say, we all have to mingle now. It was so great talking to you. Thanks for having me, Ethan. It was really great to chat. And thanks, Jason. It was really great.
Yeah, absolutely. Cheers. Talk to you all
Thanks,
later.
everyone. Bye.